to Nersa to claw back any additional unforeseen cost, and Nersa is obliged to consider it in terms of the formula. There had been particular unhappiness from stakeholders with the fact that the latest round of increases would compound the pain already inflicted on business and residential consumers by the fact that the utilities prices had already trebled between 2007 and 2012. Now, to take this discussion forward, we are joined in studio by Professor Raymond Parsons. He's a professor at the Northwest University Business School. Professor, good morning to you and welcome to AM News.
Hi, Elvis.
Now, what do you make of the 8% increase?
Well, Elvis, as you know, there are a number of red lights flashing in our economy at the moment. Inflation, low growth, unemployment, weak confidence, high deficits. So this is just another big red light which says that our energy costs are really becoming unaffordable. And as you indicated, there's been a run-up to this decision. And the common thread that runs through, for example, the statements by the Reserve Bank is that their problem with inflation is administered prices in general, and in particular, the Eskom tariffs. Mm-hmm. They make it very difficult to get that inflation rate down. So for consumers and for business, this is a tough period, and I see the reaction really from a lot of consumers and indeed business people is not so much one of criticism, but almost one of desperation, because it's difficult to accommodate this. Mm-hmm. Now, the good news is that, firstly, this increase will only kick in on the 1st of April next year, so there's time to think about it. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it can, and this is something that, of course, Nersa still has to decide, be spread over more than 1 year to try and give us a bit of a soft landing. Mm-hmm. But in fact, really, this is the tip of the iceberg of the problem we're facing.
And we're going to talk about that tip of the iceberg.
In regard to the whole structural issue of our energy supply, its pricing, its costing, and so forth. Mm-hmm.
But the increase, the 8% increase over the period, is it enough to secure our energy supply?
Well, some people would say that the methodology that is being applied, and which has been applied since 2012, is obviously not working well, because the gap seems to be widening. The fact that you have to come now, after having agreed to the 8% earlier, to now perhaps superimpose another 3 or 4%, maybe even 5% on a worst-case scenario, that suggests that the whole multi-year pricing formula does need to be revisited. I think that's quite important. That's certainly one of the issues that our experience of the past 2 or 3 years is now telling us, because the gap between the costs and the revenue of Eskom is really, it's actually escalating. Mm-hmm. And it's quite clear that this formula is no longer adequate. And we'll have to look at that again.
Now, under this multi-year pricing formula, and I'm going to read this, Eskom is entitled to make a supplementary application to Nersa to claw back any additional unforeseen cost. Now, this seems as if the consumer is being conned here, because it doesn't seem, it seems like the 8% is on the table, but in essence, the increase can be much more than that.
Well, it is going to be more, just how much we'll still have to see. So instead of 8%, you may end up with 11, 12, or even 13% by next year. Nersa is acting in accordance with the methodology, so you can't blame Nersa. In fact, if anything, you should look at the fact that Eskom asked for 17 billion rand and was given 7. That's only 40% of what they asked for. So I think that all that Nersa is doing is to critically interrogate what has been applied for by Eskom and then scale it down and say, well, nonetheless, that will still mean an increase in tariffs. And of course, whatever the reasons, we can justify it from a technical point of view, but you're not going to change the impact on business and consumers at a very vulnerable point in our business cycle.
And what is that impact, Professor?
Well, the impact is that if you take the worst-case scenario, and if you project to next year, it could make a 0.03 or 0.04% difference to the CPI. And this is, of course, something which guides the Reserve Bank in deciding about interest rates and so forth. So quite clearly, we need to look behind these numbers and say, what are the structural challenges about Eskom and about the supply of energy that we need to address urgently now, very urgently?
But what about the effects on business planning? and investor confidence in the economy and in general?
Well, it's not positive simply because everyone has been planning on the 8%.
Yes.
They knew there would be some supplementary decision, but not of this magnitude. I think, so there's quite clearly something in the formula that we need to address. But then we've got to go further. We've got to say, look, for example, the whole way in which Eskom operates, the fact that it really ought to have more competition, and that's a large part of the solution. The days of an Eskom monopoly should now be over. The government, as the shareholder in Eskom, has to come to the party. It's quite clear that the financing of Eskom needs an injection from the shareholder to help stabilize the finances. But all these issues need to be addressed urgently, because, in fact, someone might even say, but didn't Eskom just declare a profit recently? Where has that gone to? So quite clearly, there are a number of unanswered questions which need to be answered quickly. Fortunately, there is a cabinet committee which was appointed, I think, a few weeks ago, to look at the issue of the capitalization of Eskom. But that committee needs to look at other structural aspects. You can't just throw money at Eskom and expect the problem to be solved.
I'll tell you what, I see red lights and I hear alarm bells ringing, because this particular multi-year pricing formula, it seems there's something wrong with it. What is wrong with it, or is there something wrong with it?
Well, I think simply that it was meant to be a supplementary mechanism, and quite clearly it's having to accommodate much bigger distortions in the finances of Eskom, and it's showing the strain. And the fact that after having agreed to an 8%, you now have to come along and you may have to impose another 3, 4, even 5%, I think is not helpful to planning. And the whole idea of a multi-year formula was to give certainty and predictability to households and to business, that they could plan on that basis. So I think this has to be revisited as part of the process.
But are there any options available to the parastatal?
Well, as I said earlier, quite clearly there's the issue of the shareholder, the government, having now to decide how it's going to capitalize this parastatal in future. Will it do it out of the taxpayers' money? Will we perhaps look for a strategic minority shareholder? You know, I think we must try and think creatively now, because Eskom has an important role to play, and we need to restore confidence in its finances and in its pricing. And quite clearly, it's part of the vulnerability that this economy faces. It's right at the top of the list of the constraints that the country and its economy are facing at the moment.
In closing, Professor, your thoughts?
Well, one of the newspapers today said, look, the consumers and business must just bite the bullet of this decision. They must accept that this is the way it's going to go. I would simply counsel that when we talk about the methodology and what has to be done, we must not find that in 2 years' time, having applied these measures uncritically, we find that the operation was a success, but the patient died.
Professor, thank you, as always, for your time here on AM News. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
That was Raymond Parsons, Professor at the Northwest University Business School.